morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of the Diversity Committee, we are so excited to present to you Judge Bernice Donald. The judge will be speaking to our own Erica Balkes. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Erica.
Thank you, Ramla. I have the honor and distinct pleasure of introducing to the firm a woman who has been an incredible influence and an inspiration to me. Judge Bernice B. Donald grew up in Olive Branch, Mississippi. There, she was one of 4 students to desegregate the local high school. She worked at the South Bell Telephone Company while attending the University of Memphis and then the University of Memphis Cecile C. Humphreys School of Law. After practicing law for a little more than 3 years, at 30 years old, she ran for her first judgeship, which she won. She became the first African-American woman judge in the state of Tennessee. She was elected to the criminal division of the Shelby County General Sessions Court. 6 years later, she was appointed to the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Western District of Tennessee, becoming the first African-American woman bankruptcy judge in the United States. In case you were wondering, she can still recite the bankruptcy code almost verbatim, having personal experience with that. In 1995, President Clinton nominated her to the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Tennessee, and then 15 years later, President Obama nominated her to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th. She was the first African-American woman to hold both of those judgeships. Suffice it to say, I think Judge Donald saw each glass ceiling in front of her, noted it, and then continued her ascent. Judge Donald, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with me and K&L Gates. I'm thrilled that you're here.
Erica, thank you very much for the invitation to join the K&L Gates family for a conversation on race. I applaud you, the Diversity Committee, and the firm for doing this. And I thank you for inviting me into this conversation. It's great to see you, even if virtually.
I agree. Thanks so much for dealing with the technical challenges here. Well, just to jump right in, throughout our many conversations over the years, you often repeat Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, "Let us realize the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." This quote often grounds me, but as I prepared for this discussion, it occurred to me that you personally have been on the forefront of so many changes in society contributing to that bend. As a student, you desegregated public schools in Olive Branch, Mississippi. You held 4 judgeships for which you were the first African-American woman in each position. You've written so many books and articles on justice and legal system. You've served as the chair of the ABA's criminal justice section, and I could go on for the rest of the hour. But what in your early life pushed your focus on justice?
Erica, thank you for noting that quote, because it is a quote that I recite often. And I tell people once reciting that quote that the arc doesn't bend of its own gravitational force. It only bends because people put their hands to the arc and push and pull it in the direction of justice. And I think that is one of the things that I realized very early in my life. I grew up in the segregated South, as you've noted, in a small town called Olive Branch, Mississippi. As you've heard me say, that the town was very much segregated. The African Americans lived in the rural communities that ringed the town. And to give the folks on this call a sense of Olive Branch, which sounds like a very peaceful place, and indeed it was a sleepy little southern town. Most towns had town squares. Olive Branch had a town scalene triangle. And African Americans would come into town to do shopping on the weekend and then go back into their rural communities. So the town itself and the commerce there was largely white. But growing up in Olive Branch, there were very clear divisions on race. It was difficult for me to reconcile that with the words that I read in the textbooks that spoke to and extolled equality. My parents, who were hardworking people, family oriented, all of the things that we are taught to cherish, but they had to eke out a living to support the family, and their opportunities were very much limited by the circumstances in which they lived. I also watched my parents work hard to try and help as best they could in the efforts to desegregate public institutions and to help create a future that was better for their children that they enjoyed. I saw that, and as a child, of course, we all want our parents to have whatever their skills and talents will enable them. But I saw my parents struggle throughout their lives and deny themselves so that their children could have certain things. In growing up there, when in the late 50s, early 60s, there were a number of people who came to the community to help in the desegregation efforts. 3 of those individuals came to our community and help with those efforts. And seeing them and looking at the difference between their lives and our lives was just really marked. And I read those words about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the life for African Americans in our community was always very perilous. Perilous, not because of violence necessarily, but because of what people had to do to eke out a living. And you've heard me say this. Remember that the first of the Brown cases was filed when I was unborn. And when I was born, Brown at that time had been filed in the district court, but the Supreme Court issued the decision, and Brown won in 54, and I was 3 years old. They issued the remedy space in 55 when I was 4 years old. And yet when I started school, Erica, in however many years later, even though the law of the land, the supreme law, said that separate but equal is inherently unequal, I started my early school years in a 2-room cinder block school where grades 1 and 2 were in one room and grade 3 was in a separate room. And the other African-American students who went to school across the cemetery at the Black church. Now, the Black church was a large 1-room building. And so their classrooms were divided by pews. So these 4 pews might be the 4th grade, these 2 might be the 5th or whatever. But that's the way it was. And our school had none of the amenities that the white school had. Our school had no indoor plumbing. There was no cafeteria. There was no lab equipment. And all of our books were handed down to us when the white school discarded those and sent them to the Black school. And so those kind of things and the recognition of the differences that I felt day in and day out, I think encouraged me to early on do whatever I could to try and make equality a reality and to commit myself to justice in the way that I could. I'm reminded that none of us can do everything, but each of us can do something. And that thing that we can do, we must do to bring about the ideals that are discussed in our founding documents.
I remember one story you told me is even after the desegregation, you still face significant challenges. I think you went on a school trip once that was difficult for you to deal with, and you were.
Yes, well, I was at the Black school through the completion of my 10th grade year, and Mississippi, even in light of Brown, did not begin to desegregate its schools until after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, when the federal government said, if you don't desegregate, you're not going to get any more federal education money. And so they grudgingly said, okay, we'll do it, but we can't do it all at once. And so they started with the elementary schools and they implemented the choice plan. So at the end of the 1966 school year, um, Mississippi decided then that junior high and high school students could choose to go to the white school if they wanted to. And so I was one of the students who elected to go to the white school. I began my 11th grade year at the Olive Branch High School, which had previously been all white. So I was one of 4 African American females who went to that school. And it was really, really a tense environment. There were um, activities that made you feel and know that you were not welcome there. There were some students, obviously, who accepted this um, integration effort, but there was not a sense of inclusion. We were there, but it was a very difficult period. The teachers were, I later learned, instructed not to give any African American students any information about college. We did not get the kind of counseling that other students got. We, in some places, were separated. For example, in my algebra class, I was the only African American student there. And the teacher assigned me a spot on the front row and would not permit any other students to sit in that row. And so I had the entire class in back of me, and you could hear people, kind of snickering, and you could only imagine, and we all imagine the worst when we can't see and be a part of that larger group. But the first year I was there, even though I'd been an honor student at the Black school, I guess kind of like they do now in basketball, you couldn't just come to the new school and walk on to the honor society. Your status didn't transfer. So I had to sit out my junior year, and I was eligible for the honor society for the first time during my senior year. And I became a member of the honor society. I was the only African American student who was a member. Well, the honor society scheduled a trip to go to New York. And I was obviously included in that. I was terrified because of the hostile environment at the school. I went home and told my parents that the Honor Society was going to go to New York, but I understood that we could not afford for me to go and that was okay. The truth is, I was terrified of being away from my family and the safety that I had there, going off with these students who many of them had not been kind. But my mother said, and they were going to go on the bus. My mother said, if they're going, you're going. That was not what I had wanted to hear, Erica, because I was not I was not comfortable with that notion. But she said, I don't know how we're going to do it, but if they go, you're going. So I went back and I signed up for the trip. And then the school said, it will take us too long to get to New York on a bus, so we're going to fly. Well, I thought, okay, I know now that I can't afford to go. So I went home and excitedly told my mom, they're no longer going to take the bus, they're going to fly. And I know that we can't afford that, because at that time, my mother was working as a domestic. But she said to me, I'm not sure how we're going to do it, but if they're going, you're going. And that was her decision. So I went to New York. She found the money for me to go. We flew Republic Airlines to New York, and it was an amazing thing. Here we were, a bunch of country kids going to New York, and there had been a lot of division. We focused on our difference at our school in Olive Branch, but we got to New York, and the New Yorkers viewed us as aliens, because in Olive Branch, people always spoke. You would walk down the street and you would speak to perfect strangers. So we're walking down the streets of Manhattan saying to people, hello, and waving to them, and they're looking at us as if we're Martians. And because of the way the New Yorkers treated us, we started to focus on our similarities rather than our differences, because at that point, all of us were out of our element. And that was an experience that when I, for the first time, felt really close to my classmates, because the whole act of all of us being excluded drew us together. Now, I won't tell you that lasted once we got back, but for that moment in New York, we were the same. I'll tell you another kind of embarrassing thing, but since I've shared with us and shared it with other people, and Jennifer Eberhardt has written this in her book, being the only student on that trip, we went to a very fancy New York restaurant. called Tavern on the Green. I came from a very large family, so we didn't go to restaurants in Olive Branch. And at this restaurant, here I am with my classmates, and we have a menu put before us. And I'm looking on the menu for something that's familiar to me, and there's nothing on there. And I was embarrassed. I didn't want to show that I didn't really know. But I finally found Cornish hen on there, and I thought, hen, that's chicken. I can order that. I can eat that. And they brought it out, and I'd never seen a Cornish hen before. And I didn't know what it was, so I wouldn't eat it because it looked like a bird to me. But one of the students, one of the white guys who was in the group said, "Bernice, you're not going to eat your Cornish hen?" And I was like, "Oh no, you can have it." And so he took that, and that made me feel more included there because I shared food with someone. But yeah, that was an interesting experience that I always remember and treasure.
Yeah, I mean, I love that story, and you've shared that with me before, and it's just a little uplifting in hard times. But it seems, your childhood and your experiences. I mean, it seems pretty much like you were destined to go to law school, and move to Memphis, where you've spent the majority of your life. And one of my other favorite stories of yours is, after going through law school and you had some experience with nonprofit work. You were struck out on your own, which is always so inspiring. In terms of right out of law school, opening your own opening your own practice. But what prompted you to consider running for a judgeship at 30 years old?
I have always been outraged by injustice, and I want to go back and talk about law school first. Remember, I told you about students coming to Olive Branch to help with desegregation efforts. Well, three of the people who came to Olive Branch stayed in my home. They were young lawyers. They might have been ABA members, I don't know, but they were three young white lawyers, two guys and one female. And they stayed in our home because they were outside agitators. They were not welcome to stay in hotels, but more importantly, Olive Branch didn't have any hotels. So they had to stay with families. And this happened all over the South. When I looked at those young people and thought how brave they were to travel far from home, to come and help a people that they didn't even know, to put themselves and their lives at risk, their families, to allow them to do this was really amazing. And it later occurred to me that they believed in those words that they had read in books about equality and freedom for all people. And I thought for a brief moment how wonderful it would be to be a lawyer. But then when I did my own inventory, there was nothing about me that suggested that I could do what they did. And I really just sort of put the thought away. And it was, I guess, hidden in my heart for a long time, but I never even dreamed of acting on it. I went to college to become a librarian. But I've always been a volunteer, and during a time in my life, I volunteered at juvenile court. And I saw what I believed to be children treated unjustly. There were children who were detained for status offenses. And I thought, I want to go to law school so that I can represent children. I have to be candid. To this day, I've never represented a child, but that's what got me in law school. And you've gone over my career, but I became a public defender. And I was in court one day, and there was a woman who was treated in a dehumanizing way by the judge. She was poor, she couldn't afford a lawyer, and the series of questions that the judge put to this woman really stripped her of her dignity and her humanity. And I thought to myself, if people cannot expect to be treated with dignity and respect in church, in temple, in synagogue, in mosque, and in court, where else can they have a reasonable expectation? And no one should be judged to be less than human, to be treated and to be robbed of that basic respect because they have committed some offense for which they are presumed innocent. And I decided that I could do better than that. And I made the decision that I would run for judge. It was a huge decision because, as you said, I was 30. I'd only been out of law school about 3 years. I'd been in the courts every day as a public defender, representing the poor and being a voice for those individuals. But I thought, I can do this. And I made a commitment to myself that if I won that position, that I would make sure that everyone who came in the court where I presided would be accorded that same dignity and respect. And if I could jump forward, and I'll come back to this, I will tell you that I ran that election in 1982, and I did prevail, becoming the first African American woman to become a judge in the history of Tennessee. The clerk of court staffed the courtroom for me, and when I took office, I had my ceremony the morning of September 1 of 82. There was the press there because of the historic nature of the event. My family and friends were there. And that afternoon, Erica, I had a docket. Now, there were only 4 cases on the docket, but I had a docket. And when I opened court the afternoon of September 1, the clerk of court had staffed my court as follows. There I was on the bench in my black robe, ready to do justice, an African-American female. Seated just below me were my 2-minute clerks, an African-American female to my left and an African-American male to my right. At a 45-degree angle on the floor was the prosecutor, an African-American male. And the security team assigned to my courtroom was 3 African-American men and 1 African-American woman, each in Shelby County Sheriff's Deputy uniforms with a standard 38-issue Smith & Wesson strapped to their side. And we were open for business. The first person who came into the courtroom was a young white male charged with a traffic offense, speeding or something like that. He came in, he looked around the courtroom, his eyes grew quite wide as he looked around and saw no one who looked like him. He came to the courtroom, I'm sure with fear and trepidation, and asked me for a continuance. And I granted that for 30 days. 30 days later, he came back to court with an African-American defense attorney. Now, that may have been the attorney he was going to hire anyway. I don't know. But I suspect it was because he felt like, how am I going to get justice in a place where there's no one who looks like me? Now, African-Americans go through this same situation probably day in and day out in many places across the country, but I thought the perception of justice is as important as the reality. Everyone, no matter who they are, no matter what their socioeconomic status, race, or whatever, ought to feel that they have just as good a chance of being treated justly as anyone else. And so after that, I told Mr. Goldsby, the clerk of court who had staffed the courtroom, that we needed to make some changes, that we needed to have a diverse pool. And so we switched out 2 of the African-American deputies and brought in 2 white males. And just that change in the courtroom staff, I think, created a different vibe. And, people have said to me when I have told this story, why is it that you feel or you felt that you needed to accommodate? Well, because I really believe that everyone ought to feel that there's no barrier, no arbitrary barrier of birth that impedes their ability to have justice. And I will say, you've heard me tell this before, that there were many years ago, more than 50 years ago, an organization called the National Conference of Christians and Jews did a study to ask people whether they believed they could get justice in America's courtrooms. Overwhelmingly, African Americans felt that they could not get justice in a courtroom, whether it was civil or criminal. That was followed closely by Latinos and then Asian Americans. Whites had the highest degree of confidence that they could get justice in the courtroom, whether it was civil or criminal. But everyone going into courtrooms around the country ought to feel that justice is within their grasp. And we as stakeholders have to work to make certain that that is reality.
Yeah, I think one of my treasured memories from clerking with you is your pointed effort to, I mean, you brought us to Shelby County General Sessions Court. You knew
Yeah.
every single guard's name, you knew every single judge, you knew every staff person there. I mean, talk about a humbling experience to walk into Shelby County General Sessions Court and see the true, Memphis.
Right.
I mean, I wasn't from Memphis. I'd never been there before I moved there for you. And I mean, it was such a humbling experience, and to have those experiences really informs me when I'm making decisions about, okay, if I'm going to put together a panel, who's going to be on it? What's it going to look like? Is it going to feel inclusive for people? And so I think that your focus and you still to this day bring those thoughts through your work.
Right. And I do think it's important, Erica, for me, for my clerks to understand what the reality is in the local and state courts. Most people's view of justice is not going to be shaped in federal court. It's going to be shaped in some lower court, like the traffic court, or even the General Sessions Court. It's going to be shaped somewhere other than federal court. But we federal judges and the clerks working with us, we're reviewing the actions of state court, and it's important for us to understand what goes on there, how those experiences shaped some of the information that we're looking back on. And I do believe that's important. Plus, when I take people over there, they get to see where my judicial journey started.
And in continuing your judicial journey, you recently completed your master's in judicial studies from Duke University. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Your thesis focused on the rule of law and the Memphis Massacre.
Yes.
Many people don't know about the Memphis Massacre of 1866. I hadn't until I clerked for you, and we worked with the local community and the U.S. Park Service to commemorate it, which was an amazing experience. And I still have that plaque that the Park Service gave us today. It's actually in my office, and
Wonderful.
there I would show you. But what about the Memphis Massacre is so important that we should know about?
America is a great country, but America doesn't always embrace all of its history. And the Memphis Massacre is one of those periods in history that was really tragic. It is not one of our shining moments, but some good hopefully did flow from that. In 1866, right after the Civil War, and the title of the thesis is when the rule of law breaks down, and I'm using the Memphis Massacre as a case study, and for people who want to look at that, it's published at Boston University. But right after the Civil War, when in Memphis, when Union troops were there patrolling the city, there was a clash, and some of these troops were African American. In fact, most of them were African American. The sight of African Americans with guns enraged the community. There was an incident, a little bit of a skirmish one day that between African Americans and whites, and as a result of that, racial tensions were fueled. The local police and fueled by the newspapers and others ended up launching what turned out to be a massacre of the local African American community. There were more than 40, I believe there were maybe 76 African Americans who were killed. There were a number who were injured. There were people who were robbed and raped. All of the homes of African Americans were burned, as were churches and the schools. And eventually, troops were sent in to quell the massacre. It only lasted 3 days, but troops had to come in to quell this. People filed their claims, but the newspapers wrote about this. and not the Memphis newspaper. They wrote, the Memphis newspaper in part fueled the massacre, but newspapers wrote about it, and it made its way all the way to Congress. And there was a massacre that occurred in New Orleans in July of that same year. But the Congress realized that because of the violence that was occurring in the South in response to the emancipation and the freeing of slaves, that they had to do something to bring about greater protections. And while the radical Republicans had been trying to get an amendment passed, the images that came out of the South and the testimonies that came out of the South led ultimately to strengthening the coalitions that ultimately passed the 14th Amendment. They realized they had to make these African Americans citizens in order to give them some measure of protection. And there's a wonderful book that's just been published by Dr. Beverly Bond, whom you met, and Dr. Susan O'Donovan from the University of Memphis, called Remembering the Memphis Massacre. But those were two, the New Orleans one and the Memphis one happened in 1866. And that was actually, as you remember, Erica, there was actually resistance by the Historical Commission to this plaque, because they wanted to basically say that, well, it was tantamount to saying, there were good people on both sides. But what they wanted to do is to say these were the Irish, and it was just the riot. There was a huge pushback against the use of the term massacre, but that's what it was. So it was really, and we have to know and embrace all of our history. And as you mentioned, you didn't know about this. I didn't learn about this in school, even though I'm living in this community. So we have to embrace all of that history and reckon with it.
And I do think that experience and watching you, frankly, navigate the politics of the historical society and who was on there, and their basically flat out refusal to use the word massacre, and their kind of, frankly, whitewashing of history there. It was very, very interesting, because you think, something like this, where there's clear wrong and clear issues, and, it's literally hundreds of years later that these, issues still wouldn't be still in dispute today. And watching you kind of navigate those issues really in real time was frankly fascinating, in the sense that I just can't believe that those,
Well, I'm glad you are here to help me, and the Park Service has reached out on a couple of other issues that we're working on. But it's important to know that history, and it's important. I think that's part of the value of having, for me, diverse people around me helping with things. And I guess it also helped that the mayor at that time was a former student. So, yes.
Yep, I remember the many calls. I know, and just along those same lines, the world today, at least, seems more divisive than ever. There's protests, there's anti-protests, there's, on the news, what people are saying and concerns along those lines. I mean, what do you see as our individual responsibilities as lawyers and as people to further the rule of law, just given the current context and the topics that are really on the forefront of everyone's mind today?
Yeah. I go back to the point I made before, that all of us can do something. And to the extent that we start with ourselves, examining our frame, acknowledging who we are and how we interact with other people, and how we talk about equality. This time in these protests, it has been really amazing to watch, because the protests themselves are so diverse, which tells me that there is a yearning for equal justice. And this is coming in the context of criminal justice and police reform, but in other areas, we have to translate those same messages, that we have to have a society where everyone, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, religion, has an opportunity to achieve his or her full potential. And we lawyers are the gatekeepers. We're the ones who level the playing fields. We're the ones who assist with the promulgation of policy. We're the ones that politicians and CEOs and others come to for guidance. And we've got to always make certain that we are looking broadly at how we speak the language of equality. We counsel people. We have to say that in our circles, individuals, regardless of those arbitrary characteristics of birth, have the ability to do the work, and we have to give them that opportunity. And I think we start by modeling that behavior. You know that in 1986, in the American Bar Association, Dennis Archer, who was at that time not the president of the ABA, but he was over an organization called the Commission on Opportunities for Minorities. There were people not being able to get firm opportunities, but through the American Bar Association, and I hope Mike Greco, who's with your firm, who's also a past president of the American Bar Association, is in the audience today. And if he is, I salute him. But they formed this commission to demonstrate that lawyers of color could do the same high quality work that lawyers not of color could do if given the opportunity. And that was a wildly successful opportunity. So lawyers who are of Asian descent, who are Latinos, who are African American, who are Native Americans, had the opportunity to say, we can do the work. And if given the opportunity, we will do the work. So we started by making certain that we have inclusive environments, and then that we look at our communities. Many of us, we go through the same routine. We have no idea what's going on in our larger communities, but there are a lot of things we can influence there through influencing policymakers, using our voice to make conditions better for others. So those are some of the things that we as lawyers can do. We can speak, we can advocate, we can write, we can do what lawyers do, and we can call out unjust policies.
The fire alarm's going off, so I'm going to mute, and Chris is going to ask you the next question.
Hey, Judge, here's the question. On a somewhat separate note, I wanted to talk to you about diversity. I greatly admire your dedication to diversity. I don't think a lot of people know this, but I was the only white person in your office for the year that I clerked. And then the year after my clerk class, each of your clerks was an African American female. When I think of that clerk class, I often also think of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's response to the question, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? She responds, when there are 9, because there's been 9 men, and no one has ever raised a question about that. So what do you see as the greatest benefits that diversity can provide to the legal industry?
You know, we are a nation of, we are a pluralistic nation. Let me go back and talk about a talk that I gave to a Montessori school, and then I'll bring this forward. I was asked to come out and talk to these little bitty kids, and I wanted to talk to them about difference. And how do you talk to little kids about difference? So I decided I would ask them about things familiar to them. So standing before them, I asked them, first of all, how many of you like potato soup? A few raised their hands. I then asked them, how many of you like green pea soup? A few more raised their hands. And then I went to tomato soup, and a few more raised their hands. And then I asked them, how many of you like vegetable soup? And almost every hand went up. And I told them that just like vegetable soup, the nation is made up of many different people, and we all bring different talents to this. And it sort of provides the same spice of life that all of these different vegetables bring to this soup. And I think that resonated with people. You know, I try, for the most part, to never surround myself with everyone who looks like me or thinks like me. And just as I had one white clerk when Erica was here, now I have 3 white clerks and 1 African American clerk. But I did, because I'm sometimes not cognizant of what I'm doing. But when I had the 4 African American women, that was something that I did with great intentionality. And I did that because one of my colleagues called me and said, if you haven't hired all your clerks, there's this person that I think would really be fantastic. He's from Harvard. He was in my class. He's excellent. And I thought, we never discussed race, but I thought this person must be an African American. And because if he's that great, why didn't my colleague hire him? So I interviewed this person. I was determined that I was not probably going to hire them, but I did because he was a phenomenal person. But then I wanted to engage my colleagues in the conversation about diversity because there are very few diverse clerks in our circuit. So that next year I hired 4 African-American females. And whereas I normally took 2 clerks with me to court, now I started taking 3. So the judge and her clerks, solidly African-American female, would go to the court, but it never sparked that conversation. I talked about writing an article to show what the absence of diversity looked like, but I didn't get around to doing that. But I do think it's important because we learn from each other. All of us are the sum total of our lived experiences. And all of us bring something to the conversation. We all view things through that lens. None of us have a perfectly clear lens through which we view life's events. But by being at the table and sharing experiences, we can enrich the quality of decision making. We can make it better, and we can understand different perspectives. And all of us see things from certain perspectives. Now, that doesn't mean that African-American judges are going to view the law differently than somebody else, because we all look at the law and try to be guided by precedent as best we can, but it is not clear, and oftentimes it is not unobstructed. So I think for that reason, that diversity is important. And I think that while there's never going to be an exact demographic representation on our courts, to the extent that we can have not just racial diversity, but also experiential diversity. I mean, on our courts, we suffer if everyone comes from, no offense to K&L Gates, but if everyone comes from a large law firm and you have no people from government service, if everyone comes from prosecutors' offices and you don't have people who have been defense attorneys or public defenders, we suffer because we're missing a dimension of diversity. And it's important to have all of that diversity represented to the extent we can in America's courts, because the problems are going to come from this pluralistic society where that diversity is very much represented and on display.
Implicit bias, one of the most impactful stories you've told me about implicit bias is where the doctoral candidate was giving the speech, and then I think somebody commented that his sister or his
oh yes, now I know what you're talking about. Story? Well, yeah, there was a study. There was this involved a transgendered doctor. When she was a woman, her message was not well received. She got lower marks when she did her presentations. Her research was not acclaimed as highly. And when she had transitioned to her male gender, and she spoke to this group and some of the same people, she received much higher marks, more positive comments on her work, and people said that his work was much better and a much higher quality than the work of his sister. And little did they know that this was the same person, but the gender change made the difference. And I will tell you, I'm working with a group now called Women in Criminal Justice, and we've been conducting listening sessions all around the country for people who are talking about their experiences. And I had the occasion to meet a prosecutor who's now a woman, and he talked about when he was a male prosecutor for more than, I think, 30 years, the conversations that would occur and how he was received among his male peers. There was a status that he was instantly accorded. He unfortunately was there as a part of some of the jokes that were told that really treated women in a less respectful manner. And once he transitioned to a female, he is no longer a prosecutor, but is now a defense attorney. And he thinks that the lack of acceptance that he's receiving and the lower status of respect that he's getting is in part due because of his change from prosecution to defense, but also because he's transitioned to a female gender. And we're hearing a lot of stories from individuals who talk about the level and pervasiveness of discrimination based on gender and sexual orientation that people are still experiencing. And I think we have got to do better than that. We have got to get to a point where we accept people for people and that we have a true meritocracy, because what we're doing right now is not, we use that word, but it's not the case. And many of those experiences are, and stories are heartbreaking, but we learn more from, I think, the heartbreaking things than we do from the things that the successes that we celebrate.
What should the firm know about implicit bias in the legal industry in particular?
What should they know? Well, I think that we should know that all of us have biases, and I think we need to do a couple of things. First of all, we need to learn about it. We need to be trained, and I know K&L Gates has had training. But with implicit bias, it's not just a one-shot deal. It's not like, okay, I have implicit bias, I go to the training, I'm cured. It's not like that, because everything around us reinforces some of the stereotypes that flow from those biases. And our culture is very racially hierarchical. I think we need to acknowledge and embrace privilege, but I would say start with taking the test. And I would encourage people, don't start with the race bias test. There are many of those tests out there, but the IAT, take that, look at some of the exercises, and then look in your immediate circles. Talk to individuals, but don't expect the African American or the Asian American or the Latino member that you talk to speak for the whole racial or ethnic group. Get to understand those cultures and get outside of your comfort zone sometimes. But when it comes to implicit bias, and I know there's a raging debate about whether or not implicit bias can lead, whether it does lead to intentional discrimination. And the short answer is not always, but yes, it can. But I think that when institutions, firms, and other institutions commit themselves to having a bias-free environment, come up with trainings and checklists and ways for people to self-audit. There should never be a shame and blame attitude taken, because that doesn't work. But hold people accountable, and then make certain that you don't use those stereotypes to put people in these boxes that they can't emerge from. You remember, Erica, when I'm going back again now, when I ran for judge, I went to a radio station to cut an ad at my appointed time, and I presented myself to the receptionist. There were two young white females at the desk. And I presented myself and said, I'm Bernice Donald. I have an appointment for 4 o'clock. It was about 3:30, and they said, have a seat out front, which I did. There was a partial petition in the room. And as I sat waiting and waiting and waiting, I could hear people start to chatter, and it got to be about 10 of 4. And then it got to be 4 o'clock. And I heard one of the young women say, our last appointment is some Bernice Donald. And if she's not here in, I don't know, 10 minutes or so, we're going to just shut down and go home. And at that point, I went and presented myself to the desk and said, excuse me, I'm Bernice Donald. I've been here. And they looked at me in surprise and said, "You're Bernice Donald?" And I said, "Yes." So one of them said to me, with absolutely no malice, "You don't look like a judge." And I said, "What's a judge supposed to look like?" And they said, "I don't know, but you don't look like one." And as I said, it was not a malicious statement. But what it said to me is that their response was honest and earnest, and it was born of the environment in which we lived at that time, where the judges were male, older, and white. And in our day-to-day lives, we still operate on those stereotypical shortcuts when we're assessing people. When people see me, the first thing they see is my race and then my gender. And we do that oftentimes. And some of those initial responses will determine whether or not people are going to get to a deeper conversation. We've got to make sure those deeper conversations are had. But I think firms embracing the training, making sure that you recruit, and this whole notion of I can't find qualified people, that just doesn't get it. You know, where are we looking? And we have to be open to people. And then in our social circles, ask who's in those circles. And having honest conversations like this conversation about race that you're repeating over and over again is also important.
I completely agree, and I think you put a bow on it and made it nice and digestible for us. I just, we have about 5 minutes left before I do a closing. I wanted to know if you had any last thoughts that we haven't touched on that you wanted to share with the firm today.
I do want to share a couple of things. As I mentioned, we apply labels to people, and we assume that if people are from the South, they're going to talk slowly. We assume that if a person doesn't use the King's English, that they don't have the modicum of education, that they are not valued, and we have to value all people. We can't afford to put anybody on the human scrap heap. And I think that lesson was brought home to me by my mother, who was not did not have formal education beyond the 8th grade, but she was a very wise woman. And I tell people that law school taught me to be a lawyer, but my mother taught me to be a judge, because she taught me about treating people fairly and about equality. And I want to leave with the K&L Gates firm some of the words and some of the lessons that she gave me, which still guide me in my interaction with people and guide me in my life. She told me that first, she taught me to have faith. She told me to have faith in God and a power that was greater than myself and greater than the people with whom I interacted day to day. She taught me that there's some good in everyone. She said it takes longer to find it in some, but it's worth the search. She taught me, and she said to me, you are as good as anyone else, but you're no better than anyone else. She taught me that jealousy, envy, and hatred are forces that will demoralize and ultimately destroy you, and you cannot afford to have those. She taught me to give a full day's work for a full day's pay. She said anything else, anything less than that is stealing, and that's wrong. She told me there's value in all honest work. She taught me not to fear or shun people who are different, because to those people, I am different. And she told me that you can't control what people think or say about you, but you are responsible for the reputation that you create, and you must hold yourself accountable for how you respond to people. She taught me that you are not responsible for the circumstances of your existence, but you're entirely responsible for your dreams. And she taught me never to be afraid to stand alone. And she said, stand up straight, because if you stand up straight, no one can ever ride your back. And then she taught us by example, if you fall down, don't lie there and take a nap, get up and get going again. And finally, she said, pick your friends and don't let them pick you. Pick people who are aligned with your values and beliefs, and pick friends who value you as much as they value themselves. Those lessons are the lessons that I try to live by and that I try to impart to young people as I continue to speak to them. and tell them not to be afraid to pursue their dreams, even if someone laughs at those dreams. Keep going.
She certainly sounds like an incredible woman who raised an incredible daughter. And I think, I want to thank you. I want to take the last minute to thank you so much on behalf of myself, on behalf of the Diversity Committee and the entire firm for being with us here today. Your perspective and your views on the justice system and the legal system have contributed to this firm's knowledge and understanding of the impact of race on justice and the rule of law, as well as the importance of diversity. Thank you for your time and your thoughts. I appreciate you sharing how we can be better lawyers and people in the current times and in the future. I hope you have a great long weekend, a happy 4th of July. I apologize for the fire alarm, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Well, I thank you, Erica, and I want to say to the K&L Gates family, and I know we're going through a lot of virtual things right now, but when life gets back to normal, if you ever go to, and I hope you do, to the ABA's mid-year meeting, there's normally a celebration of diversity. We have the Spirit of Excellence Award, an award that I created to really lift up the contributions and the accomplishments of lawyers of color. And we always try to make certain that we celebrate broad diversity, and I hope to see some of you there. Erica, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I thank you for how you have enriched my life, and I certainly thank you for your friendship. I'm so proud of everything that you're doing, and I'm proud of what you bring to this conversation, and you're wonderful.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope you have a great rest of the day, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for everyone for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.